Jan, your turn. So this is heartening for me, living proof that a BA can really take you places. It's the arts section over there and there. Tell us a little about your undergraduate studies. What kind of student were you? What were your passions?
Well, actually, when I started at university, I was really young. I just turned 17, and I thought I wanted to do law. So I started off thinking that's where I wanted to go, but actually, I really got taken by history. And I got taken largely through one or two key people. I think Judith Binney was one of them.
Right.
Keith Sinclair was probably another. And I was really taken by these teachers, and through that, I really became very interested in research, in primary sources in particular, and went to the National Archives in Wellington, and it started something that I had never really understood before, how you could find patterns in history and how the lessons of the past could actually inform the future, and I found that very exciting. So I was a double major in English and history, and I decided not to go with the law, but to do my master's in history.
It sounds like you could have almost embarked on an academic career at that point.
Well, actually, that's what I thought I would do. When I did my thesis, which I spent a couple of years on, and because I really got into those primary sources, I did think that I would do an academic career, and I'd actually begun the coursework for a PhD and been discussing going to the UK to study, and then I was accepted to Foreign Affairs. So it was, if you like, one of the first big choices that I have of what to do, and people gave me lots of different.
So you'd put two irons in different fires.
I was interviewed, and but I didn't think actually that I would get in. So when I did get in, it was a choice, and I was still pretty much on the university track. And most people in the university told me, don't go there, because if you do, you'll never finish your PhD, which actually is true up until now. Although I would say never. I think I'm still thinking about it. But others, and including Keith Sinclair, said to me, think about it, because this is actually a very exciting time in New Zealand history. It's a new government, a new Prime Minister, it was Norman Kirk, and a very new focus in foreign policy, sort of away from Europe and the US and much towards our own region. So think about it. You don't know how long that's going to last. So I did go to Foreign Affairs, and I think it was, for me, it was the right move.
So what had drawn you to put that iron in that fire in the first place? I mean, it's often thought that, a career at Foreign Affairs can be a passport to the world. Was that part of your...
Not really. I think that it was something that was discussed in the history department when I was doing my master's, and I thought it sounded interesting. I didn't really know anybody there, but I thought that it sounded interesting. It was something that I could quite like to do, but I wasn't really sure. But I was extremely lucky, actually, when I did get to Foreign Affairs, because I was selected to work half-time with the Prime Minister directly, to be a speechwriter for him. He wanted somebody young for different types of speeches he would do.
So you were seconded in a way into Kirk's office?
Yes, so I worked half-time directly with him on speeches, and it was fascinating.
How old were you at that point?
I was 22.
Wow.
And I'd just come out with my master's, and he had very little formal education, but he was probably the most well-read person I'd ever met. And he could find quotes for speeches from almost anywhere, just an amazing variety of sources. And sadly, he died the year after that.
I was going to say, that's quite an extraordinary entree into politics.
Yeah, it was. I still think of him sometimes when I'm writing speeches.
And then quite tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you went to the UN quite soon, or quite early on in a sense, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I had a choice, actually, between Chinese language training and going to the UN. And kind of hard to believe now, but it was just the beginning of the opening of China. I mean, China had only been admitted to the UN in 1971.
Right.
We had our first ambassador to China in 1974, and this was the first, I think, second group of young people who would go from the ministry for Chinese language training, 2 years in Hong Kong and 2 years in Beijing. So there was an aptitude test, and some of us were selected. And I was very interested to do it. But then I read somewhere that if you want to succeed with Chinese language, you have to have a very good ear. And some friends know that I didn't make the choir in our high school, so I knew that was not going to be for me. So I went to the UN instead.
Oh, what a terrible second prize. And you were there working in human rights, disarmament, social development. What were the major issues at the time that you fell into internationally? You know, what sort of...
Well, I think when you
habits-
come, to a very small mission, New Zealand is a very small player, obviously, in the UN, but I think it's punches above its weight. And if you're in a small delegation and you're the most junior one, you basically have to do everything. So I started off doing disarmament, and at that time we did have a comprehensive test ban resolution and a resolution for a nuclear-free zone in the Pacific, and it was actually a very, very interesting time to be involved in disarmament. And then I was also dealing with economic and social development. Then because there was no one else to do it, you got involved into different political issues. I think you get assignments in an office like that are much above what you would have if you were in any larger delegation. For example, I remember I was just 25 when I was sent to Cuba. There was a UN committee that was meeting there to decide whether or not to boycott the Montreal Olympic Games, whether the Africa group would boycott the Montreal Olympic Games because the All Blacks had toured South Africa. And of course the decision had been taken long before I got there. I was very alone there. But years later in Geneva, I met the person who at that time was the head of the anti-apartheid movement and most critical of New Zealand. He was by now the ambassador of South Africa to the UN in Geneva, and he became a very close ally and a very strong supporter of New Zealand's bid for the Security Council. So, there's a good side to every experience.
Sure. Were you aware as a young woman then, that you were inside history in a sense, or was it just work, interesting albeit?
No, I think that there's always a sense of, well, you're in the moment, of course, you are, and you're doing your work. But there is also a sense, I think, when you're at the UN, that you are part of something much, much bigger. And I think that not everyone likes multilateral work. A lot of people like bilateral work because it's much clearer and the results are much quicker, obviously. Multilateral work is much more diffuse. But if you like it, I think that then you do have a feeling that you are part of movements which are going on for long periods, and some of them are still going on. I mean, when I started in the disarmament committee, there was also an item there called the Korean question. That Korean question.
It still is.
It's exactly. And same way, the first paper that I wrote in the Asian division in Ministry of Foreign Affairs was on some islands called the Spratlys and the Paracels, which are those islands in the South China Sea that are still on the front page of the newspaper. So things go around.
Very much. You joined the Secretariat in 1979.
Yes.
So by that stage, to me, looking at your career path, you're really becoming a citizen of the world. Were you returning to New Zealand? Was New Zealand still significant in your life?
Oh, yes. I mean, New Zealand has always been my home. Even though I've lived away so long, I still feel it's my home. I come every year, basically. And no, the reason why I went to the UN, to the Secretariat itself, was really to combine my personal life with my professional life. And that's why I've been, as if you like, an international civil servant all these years.
Mm-hmm. When you say combine your personal life with your professional life, you can't just leave that hanging.
No, well, maybe that's a story too. Another failure I had, like the Cuban one, was that I tried to persuade at one point the Algerian delegation to sponsor the New Zealand resolution on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And at that time, Algeria had a very different position from New Zealand on disarmament. They were aligned with China, and they didn't like our resolution at all. But subsequently, that delegate became my husband. And so there's a good side to everything. And
you put that so diplomatically.
So in order to combine, two diplomats from two countries, it's quite difficult.
So you never have arguments, you and your husband, do you? You just work it out bilaterally.
That would be nice. Yeah.
You've held these senior positions in the UN, and to an outsider, sometimes that organisation can look vast and ungovernable, certainly unmanageable. What's it like from the inside, looking at the complexity of it, just as an organisation structure, but also the work it's trying to do?
Yeah. Well, clearly it's a very complex organisation, and the Secretariat is just part of a much broader system. You have all of the funds and programs and the specialised agencies as well as the Secretariat in the centre. And right now, in the job that I've got, which is the sort of overseeing the management, you've got it's about 40,000 civilians, but you've got 90,000 peacekeepers who are largely military, some police. And you've got 180 duty stations. You've got 185 nationalities in your workforce. got a budget of about 9.5 billion, so it's a complex organization. But at the same time, it's very mission-driven. So people
Yeah.
are working, I think, mostly on issues that they really care about.
Yep.
So wherever you're working with people that are very driven to succeed in their particular areas. And
It does get criticised, the United Nations, obviously, for its effectiveness and or lack of effectiveness. And I'm sure you've encountered that at dinner parties and cocktail parties. What's your response?
Well, I think, clearly the world is what it is. The United Nations is a reflection of the world. And I think that those of us who work there as international civil servants are often, if you like, confused with the governments who are actually the United Nations, because the success or otherwise of the United Nations depends upon the way in which governments can join together around issues. So you have a Security Council, which is really a reflection of an earlier time. And of course, you have increasingly complex issues that are very difficult to find consensus around. So I think that it's true that on many political issues, the United Nations has not been able to find those solutions. But I think if you didn't have it, you'd have to invent it in order to, it's the only global, legitimate convening power. And then I think on other issues, there's a lot of success. I think that we've just a couple of years ago adopted this Agenda 2030, which is something I think very important. It's really bringing together all of the different elements of the UN's work: peace and security, human rights, humanitarian and economic and social development, and bringing that together around looking by 2030 to end extreme poverty, and looking at social and economic development together with environmental issues in a way that hasn't been done before. So I do think that there are a lot of very, very positive elements that the UN is bringing to the international community.
I mean, just to maybe examine briefly, some of that complexity that you were alluding to earlier. You work in, gender equality and female empowerment, International Women's Day. So there's huge cross-cultural challenges, I imagine, in that. I mean, what female empowerment means in the developed West is not the same as in Africa or the Middle East. How do you actually go about finding common values that can be applied equally or not?
Well, I think that there's two sides to the UN's work. There's one side which is putting in place norms and standards, and that was something that I was very pleased about in the time that I was actually in the mission. So way back at the end of the 70s, we adopted a declaration on the elimination of discrimination against women, and then a convention. So there you have a treaty that countries sign up to, and there they are really held to account against certain international norms. And those norms are negotiated, but all the countries sign up to it. And that's something, I think, that goes beyond cultures and is very important. And then you have the operational side, where we're trying to support countries and peoples to be able to implement a lot of those standards. And I think that's a very satisfying part of the work. A lot of the work that I do is in Africa. And when you go to places and you see young sex workers, for example, whose only desire is to have their children to have an education, or young girls who have transactional sex just to have a school uniform or a mobile phone, and you see that the problems that they have in terms of gender equality are so much different from the ones that we have.
And you come back to America and it's hashtag Me Too.
Yeah, but the hashtag Me Too, I think it's very significant. I think it's very important that we are putting emphasis on this one aspect of the discrimination against women. And I think we see it goes across all cultures, it goes across all countries, it goes across all industries. So I think that's very important. But there are a lot of other issues that we have to work on also, clearly. Whether it's child marriage, whether it's maternal mortality, or whether it's the gender pay gap or the childcare gap in countries like this one.
So when you leave New Zealand this time to go
Yes.
back to Manhattan, what will you be working on immediately?
Well, one of the things I'm working on actually is in relation to gender. What we are trying to do is to put into our budget what we call a GEM, a gender equality marker, which is that we will ensure that there's a certain percentage in every budget of resources that will be in one way or another working for the empowerment of women. Now, this is something we're trying to encourage businesses to do, international organizations and philanthropy and others, to really see how we can actively ensure that those resources are put towards this, because that's one of the problems. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's not always the same action.
Well, you've come a long way, obviously. How does it feel having your old alma mater recognise you like this?
Well, I think it's especially nice because I don't live here. I think I've maintained a lot of contacts. I have a lot of friends here, and it's just very, very nice to share this with my mother, to share it with my longtime friends, and to make some new ones. But I feel very honoured.
It's nice sharing it with you too. Jam Beagle, everybody.